I'm here today with Dr. Irving Andre, born in Curacao of Dominican heritage, an excellent scholar of Caribbean history, a judge in Canada, and someone who's been a biographer of many great Dominicans and other West Indians, and who in 2009 had the distinct honor and pleasure as his writing partner to author For King and Country, the service and sacrifice of the British West Indian military, which brings us to the discussion this evening on the biography, Rosie Douglas, Fearless Fighter for Freedom, which Dr. Andre is the author of. Judge Andre, we want to welcome you to Carib Nation. I know it's been a long time coming, might be your most important biographical work on a distinguished son of Dominica, the Caribbean, and of the African diaspora.
Let me thank you, Gabriel, for inviting me to this wonderful program. I've heard of Carib Nation, and I know of the great work that people like Larry and yourself and others are doing to bring to the North American audience the wonderful history of our people, struggles, achievements, and you yourself, you're an epitome of all the good in the Caribbean, and again, I commend you. Let me indicate that writing this book would not have been possible without your tremendous assistance and that of others. Obviously, Rosie was a very appropriate subject for such a work, because in the Caribbean today, there are serious issues in the Caribbean about the leadership. There are serious issues about the qualities of leadership that sadly many think are conspicuous by their absence in the Caribbean. There are serious issues regarding our identity as persons who inhabit a small space, but a number of independent nations. There are serious issues about the significance of national independence. There are issues about the rights of Caribbean peoples to true self-determination. So when we speak of a biography of Rosie, this is not voyeurism. This is not some prying into the private life of an individual. This is basically a meditation. This is basically a scrutiny of the Caribbean nation, because nobody or very few people, and there are a number of illustrious leaders from the Caribbean historically, but in terms of the present day reality, there are not many persons who best exemplify the fruits of an independent nation, such as Rosie. And when we talk about the fruits of an independent nation, we're talking about those noble qualities, which unfortunately are rare. We're talking about self-sacrifice. We are talking about sacrificing personal aggrandizement for the greater good. We are talking about policies that inure to the benefit of the nation as opposed to the benefit of a few. We are talking about maintaining the integrity and the sovereignty of the nation as opposed to huckstering every aspect of nationhood to the highest foreign bidder.
Let's go back to the early days of Rosie Douglas. Where was he born, and when was he born?
As you know, Rosie was born in October, I believe it's in October 1941. He was born obviously during World War II. He was born to a family which by Dominican standards was quite wealthy at that time. His father had similarly, like so many persons after him, made the journey or the pilgrimage to Curacao. His father had worked in the oil industry, and through thrift, his father had accumulated a small fortune, which he came back with to Dominica, where he started to get involved in business. His father's progress is almost legendary. His father purchased a huge 600-acre estate in 46. But before that, his father had established a number of businesses in Dominica. His father had dabbled in every type of commercial activity you can think of. His father had been in tailoring. His father became a farmer. His father later became the owner of a schooner which plied the Caribbean seas. His father provided housing for French persons who fled Guadeloupe and Martinique during World War II, who fled the Vichy regimes in these two islands on their way to join the Takeover forces.
If you can stick a note in here, my father, who served with your father-in-law, Twist Bertrand, in the British Army, relates that before they joined the army, they would go to the home of Robert Douglas. Yes. That's Rosie's father. There were 3 radio sets in Portsmouth. I think one owned by Robert Douglas, another by Leonard Green, and the other one by Bob Garraway.
That's correct.
In the parlor, he said that Robert Douglas was so innovative a business person, if you can use that word, and if you came into the parlor, you had to pay a penny, but if you listened through the window, you could listen for free.
That's right.
To encourage people to come, you'd open the window, the crowd would gather outside the window. That was a free section, but if you came in, and he would come in and he would pay a penny, and he could listen and go back to the police station where his brother was an officer and relate the news. So Rosie's father's name was Robert Douglas.
Yes.
Rosie seems to have the same initials. Does that mean that he was a favored son?
Well, he was certainly he was by all reports, he was his mother's favorite. But Rosie endeared himself not only to his family, but also to many persons who were friends and acquaintances of the family. Why? Because Rosie, to a significant degree, perhaps to more than any other sibling, had this wonderful charisma, this openness of spirit, this generosity, Rosie, this humility, and all those qualities coalesced in this individual, so that he was loved by many of his contemporaries. In speaking to a few of these contemporaries, they were united in one generous comment: his generosity, his absence of any type of snobbery, his humility.
Stick a pin in that for a moment, Judge,
yeah.
Because you talked a lot about his father's business acumen, his ability to move from one business enterprise to another. But tell us a little bit about his mother, because his mother, I was told, was known as the mother of sorrows, because she was known to be very charitable. Tell us a little bit about his mother and her antecedents, if you will.
Yes, her name was Bernadette. And she, if you think of the Queen Victoria and the Victorian ethos, an ethos based on sacrifice and suffering, certainly as a good Christian soul there, she accepted whatever came to her as something which was preordained. She is someone who would wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning along with her husband, have all the 16 children fall to their knees in prayer. And even during the 60s and in the 70s, where Rosie faced storms of his own, first in Montreal, then in Toronto, the word was that every morning his mother would get up, kneel down and pray for hours for the salvation or the liberation of her son. But that was her, an archetypical Caribbean woman, devoted to her children, prepared to make any sacrifice for their well-being, and one who, quite frankly, was at the very moral center of the Douglas family. That bond between Rosie and his mother was never severed. It was only severed by death in 2000.
So if you can, tell us a little about Rosie's early life, his siblings, any noteworthy ones or noteworthy mention, and then let's go through his high school education and his trip to Canada.
As you know, RBD obviously has had great ambitions, great expectations for his children. And he named each of his children after either an American president or some distinguished military leader: Eisenhower, Attlee, Eisenhower, Attlee, and Mark, and others, and so on.
Yeah, so you had Michael Douglas. You had Michael Douglas, who later became finance minister, who had been in the Royal Air Force after the war. You had Montgomery, Field Marshal Montgomery. You had Eisenhower after President Eisenhower. I think you had Adenauer after the German Iron Chancellor, Konrad Adenauer. And there are several others. Well, Roosevelt himself, after President Roosevelt.
Was actually Roosevelt, yes. Certainly an American president. So RBD had great expectations for his children. And RBD manifested those expectations by making the sacrifice to send them to school, to secondary school. Some of the girls, as you know, went to school in Grenada. You mentioned Mike. Mike, for example, was sent to school in Trinidad and Tobago. Rosie and most of the others went either to the St. Mary's Academy in Dominica or to the Dominica Grammar School.
Rosie, anything particular about those schools, so folks who may not be aware of the primacy of those schools in secondary education on the island?
Yes, and by the 40s, the Dominica Grammar School was the premier secondary educational institution in Dominica. I should indicate that the fees to attend that school were such that probably less than 10% of students of Rosie's age had the means, the financial means, to attend that school. The St. Mary's Academy was founded in 1932, the Dominica Grammar School in 1893. The Dominica Grammar School was founded by the colonial authorities as an incubator of those values in young students, young male students, who would be schooled in the principles of loyalty and service and dedication to the empire.
To the British Empire.
The British Empire, obviously.
Of which the cadet corps was an important formative instrument as well, and Rosie was a cadet.
That's right. That they would fall in line, so to speak, that they would ensure the perpetuation of the colonial tradition in those islands. So that on Empire Day, the students robustly sang all the songs of Empire, dressed smartly.
You mean Britannia, Rosie,
Rule Britannia, and others. So that was the premise of the Dominica Grammar School. And in the 1940s, when Rosie was born and Rosie attended school in the mid-50s, that was still the major justification for the secondary school. The St. Mary's Academy, sorry?
Well, before you go into the academy, give us any insight into his high school life that you may have.
In terms of his tenure at the St. Mary's Academy, because that's where he attended for most of his secondary education. Again, the picture painted of Rosie was a very favorable one. Someone who was very generous with the monies he received from his father. I should indicate that certainly by the time in the 50s that Rosie attended St. Mary's Academy, his father had first been elected to the colonial legislature in 51, then later in 54. But his father would make periodic trips to Roseau, the island's capital, which is where the secondary school was located. And obviously, compared to the other students, Rosie would have had a generous allowance. And for example, a former classmate, a retired magistrate, Rosie Douglas, talked about Rosie's generosity, the fact that he generously gave fellow students, particularly the impoverished ones, generous helpings and servings of local fruits and local eats and so on. And that apparently was his calling card, that irrespective of the fact that everyone knew that he was a Douglas, that basically socially, and we are talking about a very conservative, very stratified colonial entity, that Rosie broke those boundaries of class. And Rosie intermingled with very little reservation with all and sundry. And that was his calling card. I can indicate to you that towards the end of his tenure at the St. Mary's Academy, he transferred to the Dominica Grammar School. And one of his contemporaries said that he did so for the primary reason of being selected as part of a Dominica team to compete in an inter-island sports tournament. I believe that tournament was in Grenada.
Yes, indeed. Dr. Davidson Shillingford, the former director of the truck division at General Motors, PhD from Cornell, was on that trip with Rosie and relates with a great deal of humor Rosie's presence. He said Rosie had the best jokes of anyone on that team. And, he didn't talk too much about his sporting ability, but it would seem that Rosie was a pretty keen sportsman in way of athletics and cricket and maybe soccer.
In fact, you're absolutely correct. And in fact, according to Rosie Lewis, when Rosie came to the Dominica Grammar School in an attempt to join that team, his cricket skills were quite mediocre. And in all, Mr. Lewis relayed that his experience as a bowler was limited, perhaps, to sending stones after mangoes on the father's plantation. But suffice it to say, with some dedication and endurance, Rosie developed those bowling skills, and as a result was able to make that inter-island team which taught Grenada. Yes. Again, not much is made of his success on the cricket field, but the word was that Rosie was a prankster. Rosie was the one who made everyone feel at home. Rosie was the one who would, what we would call mush, which is to say, who would play a pranks on his teammates during the times that they were asleep, by throwing powder and toothpaste and every other liquid or whatever he can find in someone's hair while they slept. So if that happened, as it did, all fingers were pointed at Rosie. And again, with characteristic cheerfulness, he would just smile and make a joke out of the whole thing.
Indeed. So, Judge, here is Rosie growing up as a favored son of the landed gentry, going to the best schools in Dominica, but at the same time having that common touch, having that generosity of spirit that he gleaned from his mother primarily and his father to an extent, because both of them, I would say, were known for some degree of charitable works in the town of Portsmouth. But now it's the time of the Cold War. The Soviet Union and the United States are in contest. It's also the time of the Bandung Conference, where the developing countries are coming up onto their own, where you have Sukarno in Indonesia, Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana. You have Fidel Castro in the Cuban Revolution. You have John F. Kennedy coming up and talking about the Alliance of Progress, and ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And so you have this happening at the same time that the Caribbean islands are moving towards independence. Jamaica in 62, Trinidad the same year, 62. The breakdown of the Federation, which was supposed to have brought the West Indies together, because we have the West Indian Federation from 1957 to 1962. Tell us about that ferment, how you believe it impacted Rosie Douglas, and how it in fact drove his vision for a united Caribbean and united Africa.
Yes, you're absolutely correct. 1962 was somewhat of a momentous year. You had the breakdown of the Federation. You had the march towards independence by some of the major countries in the Eastern Caribbean. With respect to Dominica, Dominica was part of a movement to forge a closer alliance with the so-called Little Eight. That is to say, the 8 remaining islands, which remained after Trinidad, Jamaica, then Trinidad, marched towards independence. On about 1964, as you know, that initiative funded, and subsequently the smaller islands moved towards a state of independence, Dominica in 1967, in which they achieved self-government, but the whole business of foreign policy reposed in the hands of the colonial master. Rosie famously in 61, exasperated with the limited opportunities for education in Dominica, and animated by his vision, by the vision of his father, that Rosie was the chosen one to run the Hampstead estate, which RBD had purchased in 46. RBD envisioned Rosie going to university to learn the rudiments of agriculture. So Rosie famously, after a number of efforts unsuccessful, to contact what became known as the University of Guelph, which was and still is a main institution where the pursuit of agriculture could be the goal of students. Rosie famously wrote to John Diefenbaker, something unprecedented at that time, asking the reporter that he wished to speak to the Canadian Prime Minister. And Rosie left a message, or he was told to leave a message, which he did. And 1 month after, Rosie related in his later life that he received a call from John Diefenbaker. And he related his situation to John Diefenbaker, that here he is trying to attend or to become a student at this university in Guelph, Ontario. He'd received no response. So as a desperate measure, as a Hail Mary attempt, he contacted the Prime Minister, who was so impressed by this unknown young Black boy from Dominica in the Eastern Caribbean. John Diefenbach arranged that within 2 weeks of the call, Rosie got the necessary dispensation documentation to travel to Toronto and to proceed to Guelph University, or what became Guelph University, to study agriculture.
So let's take a moment and just step back and just assess this. Here's Rosie on Dominica. He's applied to university. He's not getting through. Rosie writes a letter to the Prime Minister, follows that up with a phone call to the Prime Minister of Canada, and the Prime Minister of Canada, to his credit, responds within 30 days, speaks to Rosie on the phone. I was told that Rosie was on the farm working when someone said, there's a Prime Minister of Canada on the phone for you. Of course, you know, they had a phone, they were a privileged family. And I later read in the studies that you have reviewed that the Prime Minister sent his permanent secretary, or his...
That's absolutely correct. The Prime Minister sent a member of his government to receive Rosie at the airport, who then drove Rosie to Guelph at the institution where he attended. Rosie actually worked for a couple of months at a pig farm in Guelph before he started his studies. And I believe in the book, I indicated that he was paid, he was given a radio for his wonderful service and his wonderful efforts on this pig farm. So that was his baptism. I wouldn't say by fire, but that was his baptism by piggery. That is the best way to put it.
So Rosie now is at Guelph. He studies agriculture, but he's in he's in a country, Canada, which is within the zone of the United States, like the Caribbean is, where civil rights is now in ferment. Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement is evolving. And he's involved in a meeting where Martin Luther King comes to Canada and makes an address. Tell us about that.
Absolutely. Martin Luther King came to Canada and spoke to a number of young persons, progressive persons, persons who were very concerned by the fights for civil rights in America, persons who became and who were quite stunned and quite shocked and sensitized by the brutality, particularly in the South, exhibited towards Black people and their fight for civil rights. So there was Martin Luther King speaking to persons with Rosie in attendance, and suffice it to say that Rosie, like so many of his generation, was captivated by the power and the sincerity of this voice of conscience. So Rosie then and as he said in later years, made a break from his future career as an agriculturist and decided to gravitate towards the struggle for civil rights. Now, in so doing, Rosie was in fact taking a leaf from his father's tree. And I say that with no pun intended, because RBD, as I said, had been a member of parliament in Dominica. RBD had been very much involved in politics. In fact, RBD had founded the Dominican Peasants Party, or Peasant Agricultural Party. I may be wrong about the name, but he'd founded a party based on agricultural growers. And so Rosie was very much attuned to that type of political activity. And although it was not something that RBD envisioned for his son, but Rosie smartly endeared himself to his father, because at one point Rosie actually made his father speak to no less a figure than John Diefenbach, an RBD who was steeped in this colonial tradition, who was a proud supporter of everything colonial. You can imagine was very impressed that his son had achieved so much in Canada that his son was having an open audience with the Canadian Prime Minister. I should indicate by then Rosie was a frequent flyer at the Diefenbach's house. Rosie became part of the youth movement of the Conservative Party of Canada. In fact, I have at least one picture of Rosie in 1965 attending a youth delegates conference in Ottawa.
So just so we can get a sense of the scope here, Rosie then is in Canada through the intervention of the Conservative Prime Minister at the time, John Diefenbaker.
Yes.
With regard to which he becomes leader in the Young Conservatives movement linked to the Prime Minister's party initially. Right. Martin Luther King comes into Canada, and the civil rights movement is beginning to make strides in the United States. The brutality meted out to African Americans by Southern and other police forces in the different uprisings begins to resonate in Canada. What does that do to Rosie's conservative politics, and how do we see him evolving after he graduates from Guelph in agriculture and moves to McGill University in Montreal for postgraduate studies? What happens to his politics by the 1968 assassination of Dr. King and the Black Writers' Congress that takes place later that year?
Yeah, well, first of all, I can indicate that he went to Sir George Williams University before going to the McGill University. But by 1968, Rosie's quote unquote conservatism had been smothered by the radicalism in the 1970s. And that is manifested a number of ways. First of all, on or about 1968, you had no less a figure than Enoch Powell. Enoch Powell, the British parliamentarian who became the epitome of everything racist about Britain's immigration policies, visited Canada, and Rosie organized a protest movement to go to the chalet where Enoch was supposed to speak. And Rosie delivered a petition to Pinnock basically saying that you have no place in Canada, you should go back. And Rosie famously refused to shake Enoch Powell's hand. And in fact, you have a Montreal newspaper capturing a picture of Rosie in the company of Enoch Powell speaking to him. Again, showing by then that Rosie had become a figure of substance in Montreal at the time.
Would you say that from what you've been able to research and your newspaper reports, that Rosie was easily by that time the most prominent Black student leader in Canada?
There's no question about it, and I'm not biased for any parochial reasons. After Martin Luther King was killed, there was a protest march of about 2,000 persons who convened on Ottawa, demanding justice, demanding equality for Black persons. One of the co-leaders was Rosie. I can indicate to you also, as you know, that Rosie co-founded the Black Writers Movement, the Black Writers Conference in October of '68.
With the Haitian the Haitian medical student, Elder Thibault, both at McGill at that time. But yes, Rosie, because he was a fluent English speaker, took primacy in that co-chairmanship, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. In fact, in the book, I quoted a letter Rosie wrote to the great Cyril Lionel James, inviting him to be a speaker at the conference. And we were able to get a copy of James's response to Rosie. By then, Rosie was well known in student circles in Montreal as perhaps the de facto leader of the student radical movement in Montreal. And you know about the conference, the great intellectual figures of the day, university professors, activists convened on Montreal, Stokely Carmichael, Walter Rodney, Elder Thibault, Poussin, the psychiatrist from the—
Irving Poussin, as a matter of fact, yes, Dr. Andre, I could just say that the book is Moving Against the System by David Austin of Montreal. The event took place at McGill and is noted online as the largest Black Writers' Congress of the 20th century.
Absolutely.
It's also noted as the largest Black Power conference outside the United States up to this date in history. You had Stokely Carmichael, you had Miriam Makeba, you had Dr. Walter Rodney, you had CLR James, you had Amiri Baraka, former Leroy Jones, you had Irving Poussin, you had Roy Hill, you had Arthur Roberts. It was an amazing outpouring. You even had Michael X, the famous Michael X, who later became Abdul Malik and was later involved in the Galen Benson and Joseph Scarrett killings in Trinidad who purported to be a Black Power leader. So you had a lot of people who gathered from around the Pan-African and Black Power world to convene in 1968 at an event that Rosie chaired. And what would you say that did to Rosie's image in Canada and for the security forces as well?
I can tell you that it definitely put Rosie on the radar of the state's intelligence agencies.
Well, let's pause for a moment, because I have seen the 1968 CIA report, which actually names Rosie Douglas the ringleader. And the report notes that on the island of Dominica, people are discussing the Black Power salute given at the 1968 Olympics by two African-American athletes, I think Tommy Smith and Jones is the other one, but they both raised their fist.
Yes.
After winning the 100 meters, I think, dash, and they were expelled. And the CIA report notes that has resonated across the Caribbean, and Rosie Douglas, the CIA, that is the Central Intelligence Agency, had its eyes on Rosie Douglas from 1968, as did the FBI and the Canadian National Security. So that's an interesting bit of record that we need to basically establish here, that his importance was made manifest in those intelligence reports we now have in our possession.
Oh, absolutely. And so that conference resonated. It created a significant amount of consciousness growth among young Black students in Montreal, in Toronto, and so on. But it also triggered a backlash. In fact, I quote in the book some newspaper accounts of persons expressing their revulsion over the speeches of people like Stockley Carmichael, Walter Rodney, and some others, and so on. And it basically put conservative Montreal on its guard, so to speak. And that is significant because that conference, as you know, took place in October of 1968. The Sir George Williams University incident occurred in February of 1969. Go ahead.
So what we're saying is that the Writers' Congress of 1968 October created the sort of environment, the sort of atmosphere that was sort of, let's say, the foundational basis for the 1969 February Sir George Williams Uprising. Tell us about that event and the role of the.
Now, again, we can probably spend 3 hours talking about it, but suffice it to say that 6 students, West Indian origin, they filed a complaint that a certain professor, Anderson, biology professor, was deliberately giving them low grades in a cynical attempt to frustrate their efforts to get into medical school. The straw that broke this camel's back was when one of the students, he basically had a white student copy his answers to some assignment verbatim. Perry Anderson gave that student apparently 10 over 10, and he gave the West Indian student whose work had been copied, he gave him something like a 5 or a 6 over 10. And that to the students represented conclusive proof of the bias this professor exhibited to them. And it was not merely low grades. Part of the complaint was the student, the teacher, the professor addressed each of the West Indian students by calling them Mr. This and Mr. That. And he called the white Canadian students by their first names. So they filed a complaint. Suffice it to say that in the best traditions of the period, their complaint was rejected. It wasn't given any type of serious consideration. And in exasperation, the students, after failing to make any headway with the school administration, occupied the computer center of the university. One thing led to the other. The police were summoned, and during the period when the police tried to extricate physically the students from the university center, a fire started, and suffice it to say that the 9th floor of the building was enveloped by fire. The administration tried to pin the conflagration on the students, but suffice it to say that despite the vigorous prosecution of most of the students involved, 94, no one was convicted of the central and most serious offense of arson. Rosie, as you know, following a trial in 1971, received the harshest penalty because he was the avowed leader. He received a sentence of 2 years less a day, causing him to serve some 18 months in custody.
And what was Rosie actually convicted of? It wasn't of arson.
No, Rosie was convicted of mischief. I can tell you that that offense in today's criminal justice system doesn't carry that type of sentence in any way, in any shape, in any form. But Rosie obviously received an exemplary sentence. In the book, I recalled what was represented of Rosie Douglas, the way the prosecution framed him as a dangerous man, someone who is a danger to the society, someone who poses an enduring danger to the university. Suffice it to say, he was released. He was eventually tried, as you may know, in April of 1971, convicted in early May of 1971, and then sentenced along with Ann Coles, the Barbadian student, later senator, and Brenda Dash, I can't remember her last name, who was an African Canadian, who received a fine. In fact, I replicate or I reproduce some of the comments during the trials, and it is clear that they framed Rosie and Coles as dangerous foreigners who had to be taught a lesson. And there had to be a warning sent to African Canadians that you should beware of these foreigners who would set you adrift or set you astray. Yes. In fact, I recount in the book, the number of students, West Indian students, many from Trinidad, Jamaica, Dominica, obviously, who were deported after they were convicted of lesser but included offenses.
Was Chelly Jagan, the Guyanese leader's son, Joey Jagan, involved in this?
Oh, absolutely. He was very much part of the Sir George Williams University incident. He was one of those who was deported. And many of the students, fortunately, particularly with the exception of one of the original 6, they went on to great lengths, great strides in their academic in their academic fields. A couple of them became medical doctors. At least 1 or 2 others attained a PhD in their respective fields. They became very successful in their lives. And the significance of that was much of the backlash, particularly after the Sir George Williams University incident, was related to accusations that these students had no foundation for alleging racial animus. The reason why they were not doing well is because they could not cope well with the cold. And it's interesting how history repeats itself, because some of these very comments, these tropes of prejudice, are being echoed and are receiving a renewed breath in 2021.
Well, Judge Andre, you know, this is one part of what will be a 2-part presentation by yourself on the biography of Rosie Douglas that we're here discussing. Rosie Douglas, fearless freedom fighter, and we'll be gearing up shortly for part 2. But as we conclude part 1, you basically have laid out a fascinating outline of Rosie from birth through his high school years in Dominica, his education in Canada, and the Sir George Williams Uprising, which frankly today remains the largest student uprising in Canadian history. Am I correct?
You're absolutely correct.
And that uprising, you talked about the leadership. I can report with confidence that there are 2 media personalities here in Washington. Kojo Namdi of National Public Radio, who's well known in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. Formerly Guyanese by birth, born in Guyana. Kojo was there with Rosie, Sir George, and also Doris Dean, who is of Barbadian Guyanese descent. She's a former director of the Caribbean Service for Voice of America. She was also there with Rosie, and there are many people I remember Miss Marion Heiliger, a Trinidadian engineer who I represented here in Washington, also was there with Rosie, Barbadian Cumberbatch, and they all remember him fondly. But that leadership at St. George led to many of those persons who were supposedly not academically astute enough becoming political leaders, professionals, and Rosie Douglas eventually came back to Canada, if I'm not mistaken, as Prime Minister, which he had actually prophesied that when he would come back to Canada, he'd come back as Prime Minister. Is
absolutely quite true? Yes. As you know, he was deported in April of 1976. And again, it is a measure of the man that Rosie bore no animus, no lingering hostility or animosity towards those who may have been instrumental in having him deported. In fact, Rosie continued to make a joke of it all, even to a point of describing into too vivid detail how he had to use the washroom when he was handcuffed, he was wearing leg irons, and how he asked an RCMP office to assist him. And because of the refusal to assist him, how he just relieved himself in every crevice or crevasse or nook and cranny of the washroom on the airplane. But that was the type of person this fellow was. Open, no mean spirit, very welcoming, very forgiving. And it's interesting to emphasize that, because certainly when he returned to Dominica, and during the time that he toiled in the political wilderness in Dominica from on or about 76, perhaps to on about 95, when the public perception of him changed inexorably, Rosie was demonized by his political opponents as this callous communist who would cause so much harm to the Dominican people.
Well, you know, as a child growing up, you'd hear about Rosie Douglas. So he really, that's Creole, French Creole to mean that he burnt the computer center in Canada, that he was ungrateful. He'd gone to the white man's country and had committed all these crimes. So that was the sort of propaganda that we grew up with. But as we come to the end of the part one, Judge Andre, I want to thank you. Carib Nation wishes to thank you for your years of service, not only in the judiciary, but in way of our heritage, in making effort through your many essays and your many publications, a record of our people's march through time, both not only in way of history, but also literature and analysis of society. So we want to thank you very much. And in the second episode of this presentation, we will be looking again at Rosie's return to Dominica after his deportation from Canada, his involvement in the independence movement, his opening of Dominica and the other islands to the Cuban Revolution, and his later work in African liberation under Will Mataba out of Libya, and finally getting us to the mountaintop as Prime Minister and suddenly living or tragically living the scene in rather strange circumstances that are still mired in controversy on October 1st, 2000. So thank you for this presentation. We look forward to part two of Rosie Douglas, Fearless Fighter for Freedom by Dr. Irving W. Andre.